Just when you thought that the then public protector's report has been collecting dust, this again comes up. We saw this with the British Broadcasting Corporation, where Duduzane Zuma was trying to clear his name. And joining us to ventilate this particular discussion is Jackie Shandu. Thanks for staying. And Oliver Dixon, a social political analyst. Thanks so much for your time as well. What did you make of the interview, firstly?
I think a lot of things that we, perhaps from the Zuma family side, we heard a lot of things for the first time ever. So now we have variations of the story to compare against each other. I think very little of it came through in the state of capture report, and a lot more of it needs to come through. The only sad thing about that interview is that, it wasn't an affidavit, because the nice thing about affidavits is that it's a binding document, right? So whoever lies, Jonas submitted his, Hlongwane submitted his, everybody submitted their version in a binding document. So whoever lies can be held liable for some level of perjury or misleading of state organs.
So it's not submittable in court, but he did say that he's not lying, he's not corrupt on international television. That in itself must carry weight. You must have enough confidence.
It carries a lot of weight, certainly, because it's in the public domain, it's up for our dissemination, and we can analyze that. But I think none of us, at least I am not a forensics investigator, so I can't determine the truth or validity of what anyone's saying in this thing. So I can't tell you whether Jonas is lying or not, or whether he's telling the truth, and I can't say that about Duduzane. So I think, the relevant authorities need to investigate. And look, we're still waiting for the inquiry into state capture to come about, and for that investigation to go ahead and make conclusions there. Only then can we come back and say, hey, look, you lied to us. We think you are liable for this. But now we know for a fact, Duduzane says he and his family are not involved in corrupt activities. So if we're going to take Jonas' word for it, we also have to take their word for it. If we're going to be suspicious about Jonas, we also have to be suspicious about them.
Yeah, and until I think, the judicial inquiry is set up and we can get into the meat of the matter, it's going to be that kind of thing where, depending on which side you tend to lean on and who you choose to believe, it's going to be speculation on either side. But just looking at, number one, the issue around property in Dubai, we did try to contact the hotel, and of course their policy as well is not to disclose as to who owns property there. So we none the wiser, but at this stage you'll take it at face value that what Duduzane was saying is true, because why else would he say something like that that is easily verifiable? Look, or should be.
Cindy, in law, and I'm sure my learned colleague would know, particularly South African constitutional democracy, the burden of proof lies on the person that makes allegations. So if I accuse you of having stolen, of having harmed me, there is this principle of presumption of innocence until guilt is proved. Now, we have a lot of people who purport to claim to be in defense of the rule of law, the constitution, our democracy, blah, blah, blah. But where that ethos of the rule of law must be applied to say, we cannot label someone as a criminal until so proved by a competent court, a relevant court of law under the constitution of the country. And what is wrong about what is going on here, whether it's on to Duduzane or even the Gupta family, is that we have not had a judicial process. We have not had a court case. There has been no conviction, no sentencing, none whatsoever. There is a report and there's a process. That report, it is going to be compiled and finalized and disseminated. But I don't understand how we even, at this stage, want to say, no, we can trust this one, we can't say this one.
Yeah, but the counter-argument to that is also that, President Zuma has structured himself, he's sort of hedged himself around people that he can trust in the various security cluster agencies, and therefore that's why there hasn't been any of the claims that essentially stuck to him.
Not necessarily. You had a Nkandla mentioned case that went to court, and the court said, look, there is a basis. The president must must pay back rather some of that money. So and that was led by the opposition, and that was to show that, at least in the judiciary, there is an element of independence, and that the judiciary would not bow before the executive. You had a sitting president being found to be liable by a court of law. So this is the problem with South Africa, this selective amnesia On things that suit us, we just forget, but those that favor our own narrative. So I'm saying, I am happy to presume Duduzane innocent until his guilt is proved. I don't know of any charges against him, by the way. We just hear allegations, speculations, and you know much of this is also exploited, in particular by the opposition, to play politics. But if there are criminal cases that have a standing in law, let them go to court.
Yeah, it does. Obviously, we can't represent all 56 million of South African inhabitants, but the BBC interview, in your view, do you think it might shift the paradigm a little bit in how the family is viewed, or Duduzane's business relations with the Guptas?
Okay, two answers. No, it means nothing, because people don't really care about this sort of thing. People care about bread and butter issues. So, for instance, I'm thinking, if I'm just a regular guy living the ordinary South African life, struggling to make ends meet every day, and someone tells me Duduzane has an apartment in Dubai, I'm going to ask, what does that mean for the greater scheme of my life? What does that mean for my ability to buy bread at the end of the day? So I don't think people really care about those issues when you really ask them this. And the thing is, we make these presumptions about South Africans all the time without actually really speaking to all South Africans all the time. You know, you speak to 5 people and then you make a claim about and I think oftentimes international media does this, you know. So if for instance, if you saw, for instance, Praveen Gordhan's interview with Amanpour on CNN, for instance, that is an example of something that should be a milestone in court of public opinion, but it's not going to be, because people don't care, right? Gordon fell into a trap of disclosing that, look, I don't really have evidence against Jacob Zuma, but you know, we can make reasonable speculations. And that was something to be like, okay, wait, then why are you doing all of these things? So you know, that should mean something, but it's not going to mean anything to any South African who really just cares about the governance issue of the day.
Yeah, but it's going to mean something if that particular narrative then has the title that says this money has been looted from state-owned entities. We saw President Zuma having to answer this with the MPs, that have you favored your family and, you know, influence? There was an affidavit that was produced that in a particular meeting, Mr. Zuma had allegedly made that kind of thing. So whether people care or not, they will care if then it's linked to be alleged to be used from the state. And
look, again, right now, a lot of that is speculative at best. We're waiting for look, even if you go read the state of capture report, nothing in that report is definitive about actions about anyone, right? So, for instance, if you look at ABC Jonas' submission in that report, it's not taken as something worth acting on. It's just something that indicates we may need to investigate a bit more. Right? No criminal action was placed no criminal liability was placed on anyone mentioned in that report just as yet. This is why we're waiting for a commission into state capture. Only then can we say, look, hey, Duduzane, you looted some state funds. If it is the case, and then we can discuss corruption charges. Then we can discuss sanctioning and punitive action after that.
Correct. But normally, when you set up a commission of inquiry, right? And then it is complete with whatever findings there are. There is then a process that says, out of what is in the contents of the report, what stands a reasonable chance of constituting criminal activity
in a court of law.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean that just because something is part of a report, therefore a certain person that is implicated there is guilty of something, is a criminal. It doesn't work like that. So once the report is completed, it's compiled, and it must be studied very closely, and you need a very learned legal eye to say, here I see corruption, here I see fraud, here we can pursue.
Let's go back with the Q&A session where the SAA chairperson Duduzane, again, her name was dragged through the mud in her alleged relationship with the president, and the fact that she's now being accused of creating the mess that is at SAA. We know that that is not true, but in the environment of politicking, these are cheap shots that if they are not questioned, it then almost has this clout of some semblance of truth to it. So with Duduzane coming out, do you think, and putting these together, because they, in Parliament again, Babaga Duduzane insisting on referring to the president like that, arguing that culturally it's very respectful, a little bit mischievous, but nonetheless, what do you assessing how the family is trying to clear its name?
This SAA issue is very complex. Very few of us has the expertise to dissect any of what's going on there. So we know a number of facts about SAA. It's been dysfunctional for many years. It's been dysfunctional since the beginning of Thabo Mbeki's term to right now where Jacob Zuma is. And we need, people need to ask, why has it been dysfunctional? And I think we really need to go look into the structure of SAA. No one's ever changed the structure of the organization since it existed.
Correct.
And all of those things. Duduzane came in to have to save a wrecking ship. It turns out the ship is continuing to get wrecked. And so the narrative is that maybe the situation has gotten worse under the leadership of Duduzane, which may or may not be true because very little information is coming out about it. So we know a number of things about SAA that's been wrong. But again, a lot of this is speculative. So what the media is not telling you right now is that 39 billion of SAA's procurement budget was spent on white-owned multinational corporations,
Correct.
right? That's information you're not getting. So if I'm black, I'd be angry at Duduzane and ask, why did you not reform that part? Why is it that only 80 million of your procurement budget was spent on black-owned business? I think that's the bigger bread and butter issue for me to question. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I don't want to take us back to the, the Scopa meeting with the SAA leadership, where she was explaining those kind of difficulties in the evergreen contracts. Correct. And the fact that, you can't dismantle the systemic nature of how business has always been done in SAA in particular.
But not only that, what the media will also not tell you is that she has actually gone a very long way under very difficult circumstances, pushing almost single-handedly for transformation, for representation of black people in terms of the procurement, in terms of, senior staff at SAA. We are also not going to hear that. So it's interesting how the narrative is always crafted to suit a particular agenda. But we must warn political parties, particularly opposition. The average voter in South Africa, the average black voter in particular, is becoming more and more smart and more conscious. Of course, the theatrics are very exciting. When people jump up and they say funny things, people giggle. But when people approach elections and they know what is at stake, they say, but these guys are saying in Parliament we must go for a secret ballot. But where they are concerned, in the metros or wherever the case may be, they go there, they police their own members, they even subject them to lie detecting measures.
Yeah.
So you have voters that can see where they are being
and I appreciate, yes. And the anti-incumbency is understandable because, we are in a democracy and other parties would want to contest that space so that they can push their own ideologies or agenda, etc. Yeah. But in this context where there had been a stack-up, it's almost a, layers and layers against the leadership of President Jacob Zuma, some even arguing that from day one when he entered into or ascended to power, he was a flawed character, etc. And that there'd be the 783 that the DA uses as their election tag,
Sure.
Sure. And whatever else that you can pin on him, does it mean that the more and more we hear, not only him in Parliament, Duduzane coming out, we've heard Edward also saying that, questioning Praveen's integrity and his intentions, slowly, that might just change how the family is viewed?
No, precisely because the ANC itself is a very fragmented organization. It needs reconciliation within itself. Correct. Edward said some stuff about Praveen. His very own party, now he's putting him under a disciplinary commission to determine whether or not he brought the party into disrepute. So those sort of things aren't yet changing the narrative of the family. Do you get what I'm saying? People must carefully think about what their own liability into, for instance, where the ANC is today, what their own liability is in creating the dwindling of ANC stronghold. Because look, when Jacob Zuma won his first election, he won it with 62%. When he won his second election, he won it with 58%. There's a 4% difference that he himself needs to come and account for, right? And his entire cabinet of that time also needs to account for that. So look, a lot of the instances the opposition is wrong, but a lot of the instances the ANC internally itself is also wrong, and they also need to reflect on their own contribution towards that. this is why, for instance, factions exist, and factions are a real thing. And they push their own narratives in the very same media spaces often that the opposition is using.
Yeah.
So that also needs to be
questioned.
questioned.
Earlier you were talking about when then Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan was with Christina Mampoa and not being able to substantiate some of, the very boisterous allegations. With Duduzane now being on BBC, that in itself being a global international platform and refuting everything that Deputy Finance Minister at the time, Jonas had deposed. Where does that leave us now? If we're sitting with the State of Capture report, we're sitting with an affidavit that Mcebisi had put, and the whole court of public opinion saying that 600 million was in a plastic bag, who wouldn't have taken it back and forth? We saw Pravin Gordhan at UJ saying, by the show of hands, who had received this kind of money? The students, of course, that backfired on him. Sure. Where does that leave us in making sense of who is telling the truth or what's going on?
It depends where you are seated, particularly on the ideological spectrum. It depends how you conceive of the future of this country, particularly insofar as economic policy is concerned. Look, there is no doubt we are clear now. By the way, it's interesting that the first administration, the first government, the first tenure of President Jacob Zuma, white monopoly capital in particular, didn't have much issues with him. So yes, of course, there were some issues in terms of corruption and so on and so forth. But this well-orchestrated, well-funded campaign to say, let's undermine this administration and by hook or crook, let's get this man out of office. For some of us, it is clear that it stems from his own utterances, which, by the way, are unprecedented by any president in this democratic era, to say radical economic transformation and the fact that ownership of means of production and the wealth by the white minority is unsustainable, to also say that perhaps there is a need to expropriate land without compensation. So there you have now a sitting president completely at odds with those who want to keep this country the same, who does not want power relations, wealth differences to change. And by the way, to a certain extent, it was the same with President Thabo Mbeki. When he was pursuing his beloved IMF, World Bank neoliberal agenda, no problem. At some point, he realized it's not working, particularly his fight with pharmaceutical companies and all those things, because he could see that how white wealth keeps consolidated and black people are getting poorer under an administration that is supposed to transform and redirect resources. And thereon, almost overnight, Thabo Mbeki shifted in terms of the narrative of white monopoly capital from being this wonderful intellectual, this Sussex-trained economist, to a monster, a dictator who must go. So for some of us, it's not confusing.
Look, the same existed for Nelson Mandela. He was the world's darling angel of democracy up until he said, hey, let's talk about BEE. And the response was, again, that hostile response until they accepted, BEE is here to stay.
Sure.
Right? The same is going to happen with land expropriation. And really, going into the next election, it's going to be about who speaks best and most clearest about land. Who speaks best and most clearest about, the ownership of the economy and means of production?
Sure.
I don't think Jacob Zuma is speaking on that very clear just yet. All we know right now is a tag radical economic transformation. At the moment, the onus lies on those who want to succeed him to give us clarity on what they mean as an organization on radical economic transformation.
Do you think by now, just in closing, that Mr. Mcebisi Jonas should have responded to the interview with Duduzane on BBC?
I think not. I think the less is being said about it, the better it is to analyze this as just as general the public. Do you get what I'm saying? I think what we should wait for is that inquiry. What we should wait for is that report, and what we should wait for is that legal action that happens after the fact.
I have a different view.
Very briefly.
If indeed Mcebisi Jonas was bribed, the following day he knew where to go to press charges so that there's a process that begins. So there is not an iota of truth in this. And even in this report we speak of, he says there's nothing to back up that indeed the bribe took place.
Jackie, we're going to leave it there. Thanks indeed, Jackie Shandu and Oliver Dixon, a political analyst and a socio-political analyst, respectively. Thanks indeed for joining us. And you at home, thanks for staying with us. We'll be back with the latest news update just after the short break.